Good morning. I think we should start. Welcome to this event of the SDG Action Weekend on accelerating sustainable development goals through risk-informed investments in infrastructure. We have a few people here in the room, but I just want to let you know that this is being webcasted across the world, and we have audience from different parts of the world. So how we are going to run this session today is that we will have an opening segment, and then we'll have a panel discussion. We've put together a very distinguished panel here who I will introduce in a minute. But just to introduce the session itself, this week at the midpoint of the Sustainable Development Goals, we are taking stock of progress. And as you will see shortly, on many of the goals, we are not doing very well. A key part of the SDGs is investment in infrastructure, large physical economic infrastructure, as well as social infrastructure as a driver of human development, prosperity, and economic growth. And investment in infrastructure is lagging behind. And while that is happening, we are also losing a lot of infrastructure to extreme climate, weather, and disaster events, as we've seen in the last few weeks itself. What we saw in Libya, before that in Morocco, earlier during the year in coastal parts of the United States. We had a major earthquake earlier in the year in Turkey. So within that, how do we begin to measure risk? Risk of losses from events that we know could happen based on what we've seen in the past, but also in the context of a changing climate. So in the opening session, I would like to begin by inviting the SRSGs, the Special Representative of UN Secretary General, Madam Mami Mizutori. She has been championing the cause of disaster risk reduction and the notion of addressing disaster risk in a systemic way, and infrastructure resilience is a key part of it. SRSG, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Kamal, Excellency, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues. It is a great pleasure to join this high-level panel during this SDG Action Weekend. And as Kamal has just shared with us the importance of the resilience of infrastructure, it is something which is a no-brainer. And of course, it is SDG 9 that talks about resilient infrastructure, and also for the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is what I would like to call the global blueprint for resilience. One of the 7 global goals is about how much can we reduce the loss to critical infrastructure and disruption of basic services. Now, before this SDG summit, the midterm of also Sendai came, and in May of this year, so just a few months ago, we had a high-level meeting here in New York to look at the midterm process of the Sendai Framework, and a political declaration was adopted unanimously by member states. And there were many important calls to action, recommendations, and one of them is precisely about infrastructure. It is about how can we really achieve this goal that I just mentioned, because unfortunately we are not there at all. During the years 2015 to 2021, every year, at least, and I will say at least because this is what has been reported, 140,000 critical infrastructure every year, units and facilities are being destroyed. So we are far from reducing this. It is upward. And this is why we have always worked with the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure Indeed, even before it was established, we worked together for the launch of it so that the world can come together, north, south, east, west, in order to work together on this important coalition for resilient infrastructure. And both CDRI and my organization, UNDRR, we were knowledge partners at the G20 newly established Working Group for Disaster Risk Reduction. The working group set 5 issues as priority, and once again, resilient infrastructure is one of the priorities of the G20 process. Now, we, UNDRR, as I said, have been working together with CDRI on many fronts, and one of the things that we have managed to do so far is to establish, in consultation with more than 100 member states, what we call the principles of resilient infrastructure. Because, in fact, there is not a universal principle out there which not only member states, but also the private sector, individuals, cities can embrace. And the principles are quite basic, but really important. It is about continuously learning about what are the risks that infrastructure faces, proactively protecting them, not waiting for a disaster to come, and making it environmentally integrated. So nature-based solutions combined with what we call the gray infrastructure, also making them socially engaged. So the inclusivity should also be part of resilient infrastructure. Shared responsibility, which means that it is about not only the governments, but also the communities and the people who use these infrastructure who should have responsibility of making them resilient, and finally adapting them, adaptively transforming, because we know that risks change and we need to change the resilience of infrastructure according to the risks that come. And again, with CDRI, we have been testing these principles, putting them into action in 4 countries so far: Bhutan, Chile, Madagascar, and Tonga. Different countries, some SIDS, some landlocked developing countries with different sets of hazards, but all very important in terms of resilient infrastructure. And we have also been stress testing in Costa Rica, Panama, Trinidad and Tobago, in Ghana, again in collaboration with the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, on whether their most critical infrastructure is systemically resilient. So this is where we are. We are doing a lot, but there are 2 things that I would like to say that we need to do right now. We have to enhance the governance of disaster risk, which means that in terms of resilient infrastructure, there should be more solid regulatory frameworks that can ensure that infrastructure is resilient. We also believe, second, that multi-hazard disaster risk assessment should be a mandate, a prerequisite for all infrastructure investment, and again, stress testing of critical infrastructure must be conducted. These are things that can ensure that, yes, infrastructure is resilient, but I would like to end with one thing that I think is critically important, and critically important because also CDRI is doing. The Global Infrastructure Resilience Index, which the coalition is now establishing, developing, will cover every country, every territory, looking at what is the importance of resilient infrastructure in every country and every territory. And what this index will do is to show what is the cost benefit of investing in the resilience of infrastructure, and how can it save lives, save livelihoods, and make the economy prosper. Unless we understand the cost benefit of investing in the resilience, it won't happen. And when I say we, I'm talking not only about governments, of course governments are at the center stage, central and local, but also the people, the private sector, the taxpayer. They all need to understand clearly what is the cost benefit in investing in resilient infrastructure, and This is why it is so important that the Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure is now developing this Global Infrastructure Resilience Index. So I will stop here, and I look much forward to the important presentations by our wonderful panelists and the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, SRSG, for those opening remarks. You covered a lot of ground in a short time, emphasizing the need for investing in governance of disaster risk, informed by strong evidence base, and this work that CDRI has done in putting together a global infrastructure resilience index is a contribution towards that. So we'll hear about that from Aromar Revi, who has been one of the partners in putting together this work alongside our colleagues from UNDP, UNDRR, and others. So Aromar, the floor is yours. I also want to say, for those of us who are here, a summary of the report is on your table. And those who are watching online, they can go to CDRI website, cdri.world, and download the summary. The full report will be launched in the first week of October. Aromar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kamal. Excellencies, delegates, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to try and be short, but I'll certainly be sharp, trying to build on work that many institutions over many decades have done. And I think a large number of governments across the world are actually struggling with, because we've seen in the post-COVID world that infrastructure has led the recovery of economies pretty much across the world. The challenge, of course, is, like we've heard over this year and the many years before that, is you're continuously struck by event after event that actually impact this, whether you're in the global north or south. So I'll try and speak to that question again fairly clearly. So the bad news is we are actually falling seriously behind in terms of SDG implementation. This is the current status dashboard as far as that's concerned, and we can see that as far as most of the goals are concerned across the globe, and of course it's very different countries and regions, we're not doing very well. About 2/3 have limited or no progress, about 20% of them are kind of okay, and some of them are actually in reversal. I guess both the good and the bad news is, in a very large and rapidly growing economy, at least relatively speaking at the moment, our DRR losses are about 1% of global output. And with climate, we know that's going to increase. That's the real challenge. If you have 2.5% growth, you're losing about half of that, or slightly less than half of that at the moment, to disaster losses. You have a macroeconomic problem, and of course you have a tremendous development problem as we go forward. So basically, we need massive infrastructure investments to meet the SDGs. I've highlighted a few of them. Of course, 9 is what we're talking about today, but actually 9 and 8, the connection with good jobs and economic growth is absolutely central. This is the real issue we've been struggling with for over 15 years at the moment, how to bring together jobs, sort of green growth and infrastructure. But that is tied with pretty much all of the SDGs. Irrigation infrastructure is tied to hunger, health infrastructure is tied to SDG 3, education, of course, is a core issue. Water and sanitation and renewable energy actually drive a lot of the agenda, especially in the global south. And of course, the stuff that I've worked on for many years on sustainable cities and communities is the key driver of trying to enable equitable and sustainable growth. And finally, if goals 13, 14, and 15 are not dealt with adequately, which is what is now being called the blue, green, and gray infrastructure, then actually the rest of it doesn't hold together. So in some senses, the challenge before us, and this is in the middle of the review, the MTR process, we're actually talking about trying to bring together the Agenda 2030, which you can see on the slide, plus Polaris, plus Sendai, as Mami was talking about. Sendai is, in a sense, the orchestrating framework, the new urban agenda, because without that you don't have any growth, fine, and you don't have a lot of the employment. Plus, thankfully, we have Kunming Montreal now. So it's actually bringing together all 5 of these elements that will enable SDG acceleration. And neither, governments struggle with this at local level, at national level, and internationally, I think the challenge for us is to build a framework where, apart from what we're talking about, the goals, the implementation systems, the key thing is we have to bring in the investment in the right places, because without the investment, things are not going to move forward. So basically, our investments that we're talking about to achieve this entire agenda is certainly of the order of 5 trillion or more to do all of these things. Now, the question is, do you do them in silos, or do you actually enable coordinated implementation? This is where the core question of both infrastructure governance and governance of resilience comes in. And we're not prepared for this, I would say, pretty much across the world, even in some of the more advanced economies. So I guess the economics in this report will show us this when it appears next month, is that simultaneous investment has economic benefits and, of course, multiple synergies that we could see because, you know, the SDGs are a system which actually support each other. The other interesting piece of news is, and this is important because a lot of the critical infrastructures we're dealing with today are increasingly, let's take the case of renewable energy, being supported by private investment. So as you move into large-scale renewables, it's not only, you know, the gigawatt scale kind of large photovoltaic farms that you're seeing, but you're also seeing rooftop solar. That's both in the consumer end and it's also supported by the private sector. So we're seeing a big shift now in the potential for investment in the sector, not only in terms of public investment, which is very critical, but also the crowding in, or I would say in some cases, the private sector leading this kind of process. So there's significant shifts underway in private investments. You can see that in this graph here. You know, for example, the light sort of red or peach that you see up there is the alternative energy that's been going very quickly compared to traditional energy. This is the decarbonization. This is the pathway, the beginning of the pathway to 1.5 and net zero in some senses. But you also see social infrastructure as being very significant, knocked down a little bit by COVID. And of course, you see telecom becoming a very important driver, which is largely driven in most cases by private investment. But I guess the somewhat nasty news in this is that even if you take the large kind of, you know, the Green New Deal from Europe, for example, the European Union, the share of low carbon resilient infrastructure in that mix, and the US is trying to do the same thing, is actually still very low. We have not reached the tipping point. So I guess the question is both for public investment and also sort of to drive private investment in the right place. And, you know, we saw this happening in Turkey. Basically, investment in resilient infrastructure is key to acceleration of both climate action and the SDGs. There seems to be a lot more resources in climate action. Actually, we are not seeing that hit the ground very much, especially on adaptation, a little bit more on mitigation. The question is, how can we achieve convergence? And, you know, if we achieve convergence, what kind of institutional structures and processes could we deal with? So, in a sense, at least a contention that I have today is that resilient infrastructure is a systemic response to the global polycrisis we see ourselves in. So, you know, take a lighter tone on this. You see these waves coming one after the other. COVID, of course, hopefully we're done with a lot of that. The recession, which is currently on, climate change, which is kind of, we're in the middle of a 1.5 overshoot process, and biodiversity collapse, along with, of course, the macroeconomic questions around debt and intergovernmental fragmentation that we've seen over the last couple of years. So basically, these are all connected, they're tied to each other, and they're driven by the same process. So if you want to address a global polycrisis, you have to deal with that with a systemic response. You cannot deal with systemic risk by dealing with things individually. It won't work. It'll only get worse, and, you know, you'll wonder why you are set back continuously. So basically, you need a set of local to global systemic responses to be able to simultaneously accelerate and move forward on SDG implementation. And this is a very challenging thing because neither governments nor, in some senses, are markets very well organized to make this happen. It's still very fragmented. So the contention one has, and that's what we were trying to deal with in the global report, is that resilient infrastructure is one of the critical systemic responses to the global polycrisis. So how does that work? It works in two ways. The first thing is, how do you develop resilience of the infrastructure itself? So, you know, you have a port and the port doesn't get knocked down by cyclonic storms or sea level rise, etc. But I think the more important thing that we're discovering just now is that you can build infrastructure for resilience so that your social and economic resilience, both because of institutional processes, community-based processes, etc., can actually help you. So it's not only the question of infrastructure governance, it's also the question of fiscal resilience. This is the reason why I think, especially in the climate case, you know, more and more central banks are starting to test their systems to be able to try and understand what it means. That's a core question both for the IMF and otherwise. So basically, you need to do both things. That is, to strengthen your infrastructure, especially the harder systems, and the softer systems, which are blue, green, gray, under nature-based solutions, but also basically build up your system so that social and economic resilience, which of course is the more important thing in the long run, can actually play itself out. So how does this actually happen? And I'm drawing here from the extensive literature that we put together in the IPCC over the last 7 years or so. This was kind of cleared earlier this year in the census report. And that is, if you want to deal with a systemic set of risks, you need to actually have a set of transitions that are implemented simultaneously. And we identify 5 different transitions. The energy one is obvious as far as climate is concerned. It's also obvious in terms of rapidly growing countries, because you can't have economic development, you can't get livelihood growth without actually having adequate access to clean energy for everybody. This is a big question. It came up in G20 over the last year or so in India's presidency. And within that, the urban and the infrastructure systems are very critical. That's what's driving development, growth, employment in many parts of the world. And unfortunately, most of our systems are not designed either historically, which is including in the global north, and in the global south to be resilient. So the challenges are different. If you're building a rapidly growing urban economy, then you have to build properly so that you can actually, you get resilience dividends over the next 50 or 100 years. If you have Victorian infrastructure like this city has, for example, in New York, you have a big challenge because you've got to retrofit it. It costs a lot of money, takes a fair amount of time, but you need to do both things to make that happen. And then, finally, you need to do work on biodiversity and ecosystem services to sort of bring these things together. The idea of bringing together all of these agendas, that is the 2030 development agenda, climate adaptation, mitigation, and biodiversity conservation with disaster risk, is what is called climate and disaster resilient development. That's the goal that we're looking at. It's tough. It seems somewhat, in some cases, a little bit out of the way of where governments currently work, but that needs to get done. The reason why it's important is because 60% of the infrastructure required to the 2050s is yet to be built. And this is especially true in the global south, in much of Asia, in pretty much all of sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other areas in Latin America, etc. So this is a big opportunity for us. We cannot, decarbonize. We can't deal with remaining within the 1.5 or maybe even 2 degree guardrails without making this happen. And this has tremendous convergence with the key policy questions that governments are dealing with: livelihoods, growth, jobs, improved quality of life, etc. So what are the new frameworks that we have? And I think that this report just now and the work that we've done from CDRI and beyond DRR, etc., and UNDP over the last many decades just now is coming together. What are these frameworks? And I think the interesting thing about these frameworks are the science has actually caught up with the policy aspiration at the current point of time, partially because of new methods and processes. We actually have a whole range of different methods that are able to connect, starting from, I wouldn't say the hyperlocal, but certainly the local level upwards, looking at risks to a whole range of critical infrastructures. In fact, way back, maybe 20 years ago or more, India led that process of trying to look at multi-hazard risk across particular states in the country and build that out. So this is the global infrastructure risk model, which the report talks about, and the resilience index that Mami just mentioned just now, this is interesting because it's not that this information has not been available, but by and large, much of this information has been sitting with the reinsurance industry for many, many years, fine? But that's not sort of notionally a public good. But what I think the big shift just now is this is a publicly available data set. It's an analytical model that builds on critical infrastructure across the world and pretty much most of the critical hazards that are there. So one can access it, one can query it, and you can build the capacities of everything from local to national governments to look at this. And it does, historically, much of the work that's been done was done on geological hazards, on earthquakes and other such things, which are relatively easy to do. But now we're actually being able to embrace the climate-related hazards, and I won't bore you with the details here, but essentially what we can do is we can break down pretty much at the sub-national level what the infrastructure systems are like, and we can look at that region by region and look at that across a set of almost 10 different risks that are there. The bottom line on that, of course, like I mentioned earlier, is at the current point of time, our estimates are about, let's say, somewhere close to about 0.8 to about $1 trillion of effective loss of output at the moment because of the impacts that are there, which basically means that many national economies are at high risk. And the challenge, of course, is if your capital stock is impacted, it's not something that happens in this fiscal year. It plays itself out year and year afterwards because of the multiplier impacts that are there. And as we've seen, because many of these things are connected with each other, the health infrastructure is connected to the energy infrastructure, that's connected to how education is happening. We've seen that in COVID. The implication through the economic system becomes quite significant. So there are great, we have the analytical ability to understand this by region and look at what's happening here. And as an example here, we have for the first time, this looks at heat, which has become a very big issue now, including all over the world, in Europe, North America, and of course in South Asia, we'd have a terrible time over the last year or so. So basically, the interesting thing now is we know what the risk exposure is as far as different hazards are concerned. So the quick breakdown is 1% of output. Of that, 70% of it comes from climate-related risks. So we have the numbers just now. And we can break that down. Obviously, in some parts of the world, it's less and more, and it will change over time. And 30% of it coming from geohazards. Fine. Now, the important thing in terms of the dynamism of this process is geohazards, in terms of overall proportion, may not change, though they're very particular in the Ring of Fire in particular countries. These are big questions at the moment. And sometimes they come at us by surprise, like in Morocco at the current point of time. But the climate hazards are certainly going to grow in terms of intensity and frequency, which means that we know that we have to prepare for them, especially because we're headed for a 1.5 overshoot. So in some senses, we have some precursor sense certainly over the short run, but certainly over the medium run, of how this could play itself out. And we are in a much better position just now to try to advise national governments and of course, and even sort of central banks, etc., on how this will play itself out. The other thing that's interesting is, because the breakdown is done sector by sector, we also know where the risk concentrations are the highest, which again means that, if you look at a Pareto process, let's say, you know how to prioritize your interventions depending on which country you are. Obviously, a country in Latin America or in the Caribbean may be quite different from something in the Middle East, etc. So the big high-level point here is that roads and railways, basically transportation, telecom, power and energy, contribute to about 80% of the total annual ROSC at the current point of time. Now, as we can model how these infrastructures can build out over time, as for example, there's universal coverage of core services, SDGs 6, 7, etc., in Africa and let's say South Asia, we'll get a sense of how much risk you can accumulate in that particular process, let's say. So, the science is giving us a fairly clear perspective just now of what are the major hazards and how you can deal with them, and also which sectors we need to look at. Obviously, because the 2030 agenda is focused on leaving no one behind, the most vulnerable populations, have to be very carefully looked after, whether it's in the Arctic at one end, small island states at the moment, or socioeconomically vulnerable populations in low and middle income countries. So you need to kind of balance these things out. So we've got a much better sense of this as far as that's concerned. So the core question for us is there a potential for an infrastructure resilience dividend? And what would it look like on the outcome? Obviously, avoided asset loss, fine? Your buildings will not be destroyed, your bridges will not come down, etc. That's the obvious thing that's there. But I think the very important thing in an interconnected world where the economic activity and livelihoods are important is reduced service disruption. So, for example, in a power system, it's not the cost of replacing the power plants and the transmission systems that are the real cost. It is really the cost of shutting down of the power networks, because that dramatically impacts livelihoods and the economy as far as it's concerned. Better and more reliable public services. We know that if we need to decarbonize rapidly, public services are going to be very, very critical to making this happen. And of course, accelerated economic and social development that sit on this. And if you're able to do this in a sensible way, you can reduce carbon emissions. If you're able to think this through, your policy is organized, and you can potentially enhance biodiversity. If you're sensitive to these questions and you're not going on in particular directions that sort of push back against nature, you can improve water quality, which is one of the most critical crises. We know that the blue and water planetary boundaries have just been breached. An article appeared in Science just 3 days ago. And of course, for those of us that live in countries which have very poor air quality because of industrialization, it'll help you improve air quality. So these, in a sense, are the tangible outcomes. You can link them to SDGs. But even before the SDGs, these are the questions that national governments are always concerned about. So the question is, if you can bring these things together, you have the opportunity of dealing with current risk, you can deal with economic development opportunities and risks, and of course, climate risks as it starts building up, and hopefully not trying to overcome us as far as that's concerned. So how do you make this happen? I guess the advantage of this framework and the analytics that we have at the moment is that you can start breaking it down into small bits. So there's a lot of mathematics and fancy computer simulation and stuff that's there. So we have the analytical methods of bringing together hazards exposure, climate change, risk metrics, and taking that down into individual infrastructures. And as countries build out their inventories much better, we can actually try and look at how things work in the future. I guess the key thing for us here is that once you have that and you can start to quantify risk much more clearly, it becomes the first step for both public institutions and certainly for private investors to manage their portfolio risks. Because we know from both risk theory and otherwise, the only way to manage risk is by managing it in a portfolio. If you're going to go one by one, it's not going to work as far as you're concerned, both economically and financially. So now we can actually assemble portfolios of different types of risks. You can deal with cyclical and counter-cyclical effects in kind of systematic ways to move that kind of forward. So where does that leave us? The annual investment requirements in terms of infrastructure financing, this is a well-known fact. There's a huge infrastructure financing gap. Forget about the resilient infrastructure financing gap. But the annual requirement for infrastructure is about 3 trillion or so. The challenge, of course, is that the investments in low and middle income countries is probably 1/10 of that investment. So, you have to build up the investment in any case. This is the core question of SDG financing, how to redo the multilateral development system. That's an ongoing discussion that many of us are part of. But the question is, if you're going to do that, you might as well do it to support resilient infrastructure, because that's going to bring you quick dividends on this. And like Mami was saying, the question is, how is the cost benefit going to play itself out? So the risk models can help us do things that are very important as we go into implementation. It can help us develop national infrastructure resilient policies and plans that bring together all of these things. And obviously the situation in Indonesia is going to be very, very different from that in, let's say, Colombia or another country, or even in a large country like India. What's happening in the Himalayan region is going to be very different from other areas that are exposed to other kind of risks. You have the ability now to be able to build these processes so that the policies and plans are connected with the ground reality. And once they are consistent, they help both as regulatory as signaling devices, so that public investors and public finance and private investors can help define and manage risk much more clearly. Because part of the challenge in risk is about the cost of capital. The cost of capital is very, very significant in places that are marginalized, that are difficult to get through, and a lot of that is because risk information is just not available. So the next step on that, of course, is to build project pipelines, and again, bring back this idea to the question of portfolios. We have a whole range of new methods just now that look at the connection between biodiversity, climate, and social vulnerability, etc. So when you're able to look at that in a consistent manner, there's a potential to build these resilient infrastructure project pipelines that reduce portfolio risk, and then hopefully, as the financial system becomes more supportive, whether it's through ESG financing or other instruments that you have, including green bonds, etc., can reach out to deal with that. So I'll sort of close off here with saying that we need to build national resilience financing and expenditure plans. These are not kind of things that should only be situated in the global north. In fact, it is in rapidly growing countries, in the low and middle income countries, and the most vulnerable, that you need the plans more than anything else. Because if you look at, let's say, a country like Haiti, and we know what's gone on over the last decades, the value of having this in place, getting the right infrastructure investment, getting the right financing, and also getting in the cat bond that actually covers the risk, is even more significant in macroeconomic terms and the lives of the people than otherwise. So the value is actually sometimes much more in the margin than in the sort of, I would say, in the larger economies. But even there, it's a very significant question. So we have to move towards building these national resilience and financing plans. The science is moving us forward to enable that to happen. We have to move from the governance end, from the public finance end, I would say in some senses, to be able to open up these processes. Because again, to pick up on those three critical infrastructures: road, rail, telecom, energy and power. Private investment, especially as we're trying to decarbonize, is driving innovation in that space. If you're going to hold that back, then you're either going to get left out or you're not going to see the dividend. So one has to think, I guess, or walk on 2 feet as far as that's concerned. So basically, governments have to massively scale up public investments to be able to crowd in, investments that come from other areas, and also redirect private finance into infrastructure. There's no reason, if your signaling is right, that people will continue to invest in dirty technology, in carbon-intensive processes, apart from strategic and other interests, because they have no other option. Their carbon space has unfortunately been taken as far as that's concerned. So what are the big next steps here? I would say three big things. One is something that we haven't had, and we now have just now, is better risk models. So deepening the global infrastructure risk model is important. And it's not easy, because countries and within countries, regions have to build out their infrastructure inventories effectively. They have to build the institutional capacity to use these risk models. Having a risk model that's sitting in New York or Geneva or somewhere else is not very useful. And this is not very complicated to deal with, but it can be sort of built out. The second thing is we need to have clear country assessment of the policy options and enabling conditions. And why is that? Because infrastructure is specific to the development trajectories, the pathways that each country is going through. Depending on what stage you are, depending on what challenges you have, it may be energy, it may be roads, it may be just schools or healthcare that's important. So we need to do three things to make that happen. You need to assess feasible and effective implementation options at the country scale, or in a large federal country, you need to do that regionally. The second thing is you need to estimate your financing gaps, because without that, you can't see what's necessarily happening. And once you have that, then you'll have at least half a chance of identifying the barriers, the enabling conditions, and the policy instruments which will enable the conversion of these interests, which will make this possible. I mean, it's a big ask in some senses, fine, to be able to converge and bring together all these agendas inside governments. Governments don't work like this, but inevitably, given the poly crisis, I would imagine there aren't too many places to go apart from making this happen. And then finally, we need to build concrete pathways to risk-informed infrastructure investment, which means you have to have frameworks in place, you have to have appropriate and policies that are not sort of pulling in different directions, and you have to have financing plans for particular sectors that actually work itself out. If you don't have a whole range of different projects and pipelines as far as that's concerned, even a well-meaning financial institution, the MDBs across the world, can't finance you because you don't have something to finance in some senses. And finally, and this is one thing that's come up again and again, I think, especially in the G20 discussions, you do need to establish a risk-informed, resilient infrastructure facility, because this is specialized stuff. It's tied in with many, many different elements of development. We do have existing arrangements that are there, the Green Climate Fund, whatever it is. There are a whole range of these things. But I think focusing on infrastructure is going to be very critical in terms of actually achieving what we're trying to do. And I think we're making fairly good progress because of this multilateral cooperation from across the world. So what Asia has not got, we're learning from Latin America. What Latin America has not got, we're learning from Africa. So I think that is the real opportunity we have to try and move this forward. And I'm really glad, since CDRI was kicked off here in 2019, we're starting to see, at least within the 40, 50 countries in CDRI's fold, with all other partners, that this is moving forward quite quickly. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Aromar, for that very comprehensive presentation, highlighting many aspects of the challenge we have of resilient infrastructure and what could be the ways forward. You talked about polycrisis, which requires a systemic response. To provide that systemic response, we need to have governance frameworks of 21st century, which are informed by good evidence base, good systems for regulating it, and financial frameworks. I have many questions I could perhaps ask, but let me turn to our first very distinguished panelist. Mr. Suman Berry heads India's apex body. It's called Niti Aayog, which guides investment in development, different aspects of development, including infrastructure development. So, Mr. Berry, you heard Aromar's presentation, and he brought in this notion of resilience dividend. If we invest in resilience, we draw a resilience dividend on it, but that dividend is out into the future. So in a country like India, which has this almost infinite hunger for infrastructure, how do we balance between more infrastructure and resilient infrastructure? And the kind of analytics that Aromar just presented, how can that actually be integrated in upstream infrastructure planning, imagining the infrastructure of future? And how do we bring about long-termism in the way we think about infrastructure in countries like India?
Firstly, is this what I do? This one. Okay, yeah. Thank you, Kamal, and let me thank CDRI and the UN in providing me this platform. And I should declare that I'm also a member of the advisory group for the report that Kamal has mentioned, so I hope that doesn't in any way compromise me. I will try so because there's an audience online and here, to try and maintain the discipline of sticking to the time, partly because I have a bit of a hard stop myself. So your question, Kamal, I think was about India. A word or two about Niti Aayog, but because I'm ultimately a technocrat and a boffin, I will also talk about the analytics that were presented so comprehensively, and for me there was much that was both interesting and new. So Niti Aayog is the indicative planning entity that reports to the Prime Minister. It is a successor to India's Planning Commission, but is fundamentally different. But I think the 2 points that I want to mention here is that Indian planning, when it existed, before it was abolished in 2015, essentially operated on a 5-year horizon. Now, because of the commitments at Paris and otherwise, we are thinking, as at least formally, as far as 2030, but the Prime Minister articulated last year a vision for India to be a developed country by 2047. And so, hey presto, we have the license at Niti Aayog to be thinking about horizon as far as 2047. And I think that the insights, both of what Aromar has had to say and what will be in the report coming out, can be integrated into that longer term view, although operationally 2030 is of course still important, and there will be the global stocktake taking place this year. So that's who we are, what we do. I think what's very important, though, and this was made clear to me, before, as I accepted this position in May of last year, is that the Prime Minister sees Niti's important arena as being India's states. And so in talking to the IMF and in listening to some of these presentations, I think the issues that arise in terms of incentive compatibility, what have you, as an aspect of fiscal federalism is a whole dimension which Niti certainly is obligated to take forward. But I have to say that this is not against, that the instrument partly for doing this is what we call our finance commissions, and they have recognized both the imperative of climate change and indeed some of the funding needed for disaster risk in previous editions of the Finance Commission. So I just wanted to say that thinking about these issues tangibly is something Niti should do, can do, and we are also part of the many initiatives that the Prime Minister has taken, particularly a so-called Gati Shakti, an IT planning tool for the coordination of infrastructure across India's states. Just a couple of points on the analytics, if I could be permitted, because I want to make sure there's time for the in the Q&A lying ahead. First point, and this reflects my background for 4 years at Shell as part of the scenarios team. All of the discussion has so far been about risk. And my question is the science now sufficiently established and accepted, except perhaps in the US, so that uncertainty is largely about political uncertainty, or are we talking about uncertainty even in, as it were, thinking about vulnerability? The second very important point I think that comes out is, so what is implicit in the shift, which is certainly something that I see at Niti Aayog, from public investment to private investment. This is very obvious, for example, in our electricity generation, where, when I first returned to India to head a think tank, it was almost entirely thermal investment by public enterprises. And over time, we've gone to a model where renewable investment with certain regulatory incentives is almost entirely by the private sector. And so I think the question that then arises is the private sector better able to internalize the externalities? What does it take for the private sector to be able to internalize the externalities? And the point that Aromar made, which is that typically this kind of infrastructure belongs in the public sector because it's difficult to capture the externalities, but India took a decision 15 years ago that efficiency gains outweighed, as it were, the public finance losses. And so bringing resilience into conceptualizing, as it were, what the gains are from a move to the private sector, I think is another part where, where I think it would be the boffins who have to think about this. I could make other points, but let me, in deference to the other panelists, stop here. Kamal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry. First of all, very reassuring that indeed countries like India, many others, are taking a long view of things, and we have the opportunity to address these things in a more systemic manner. I think the two questions that you raised are really important. What is the level of uncertainty we are talking about, and what is the type of that uncertainty? And then, of course, how does all of this analytics speak to private sector and private investment? I think we'll come back to these questions, Aromar, in a few minutes, but let's first hear from our Honorable Senator Rosa Galvez from Canada. She is also one of the advisors of this process. Senator, when Aromar was making presentation, he made a reference to Kunming-Montreal process, the issue of looking at multiple transitions, including the threat we have to biodiversity. And a case is made somewhat rhetorically that we need to integrate nature-based solutions in our imagination of infrastructure. So my question to you is that, so the rhetoric has been there for now more than a decade, but how far are we from actually making it happen on the ground? How do we assess the efficacy of nature-based solutions and not just promote them as a dogma? And how do we make sure that the kind of analytics that Aromar presented for engineered structures, how do we bring the nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based approaches into that analytics in a comprehensive way as well? Senator.
Thank you so much for this kind invitation and to discuss this imperative subject of turning resilient as an integrated within in the infrastructure construction. So first, just would like to say that I myself a civil engineer, and I've been teaching, you said 1 decade, but I think that civil engineers are being talking to civil engineering students for the last 30 years that we were in this transition. And so science has been telling us for 50 years where we should be going. Then engineers came and developed all these renewable energy sources. And so what is missing, And we know about the floods, and we know about the forest fires, and we know about the erosion of in the coastal areas, and we know about cities that are going underwater. It happens everywhere. It happens in Thailand, in Bangkok, but it also happens in Prince Edward Island in Canada. So there is a mismatch between, the fact that infrastructure's supposed to last for 60 years, 50 years, lifetime, but the term of politicians is only 4 years. So there is a big mismatch in there. Also, we say that we have to be inclusive when taking decisions, but as Revi said, that all the sustainable development goals and how far we are behind, and when you see those sustainable goals, all of them that were mentioned requires the profession of engineers. But engineers are not there present in and it's not the fault of the politician, it's not the fault of the engineers, but somehow we have to be present during these discussions because we are there applying the safety factors, applying the nature-based solutions, and so therefore we need to be there. Now, it's very important, the finance, because science is there with all this evidence, and technology is there with all these new techniques, and we know that they exist, and we are creative, and we move, but finances is not there. So who is this finance? When we talk about finance, who are they? So they are the banks, they are the multilateral banks, but they are also the insurance company that it's right that they keep very close to theirs, the data, that is so important when you measure the risk, but also the pension plans, you know? And so this financial sector, right now, it's in what they are calling double materiality. So on one hand, they say to us, to the politicians and the municipalities, they are saying, we cannot afford the destruction of these infrastructures. They are, you know, falling apart. What happened in Libya, what happened in Quebec, what happened forest fires everywhere, Turkey, everywhere, Pakistan. So who's going to insure this uninsurable infrastructure? And so they are saying, help us, and to the government, put more money. But at the same time, that they are scared of this transition risk, reputational risk, and all this risk. At the same time, they are putting the money in fueling the climate crisis. So as you rightly pointed out, 1.1, we already cannot survive that. What is going to happen at 1.2? It's unbelievable. And so we cannot afford to have these double situations. So we have to bring to the table this financial sector. And to that end, I want to talk a little bit of my bill, which is aligning the financial sector with our climate commitments, because we are all signatories of this Paris Agreement. We are all signatories of the UN Convention for Climate Change. And in my country, Canada, the government passed a bill called Net Zero 2050. But who's moving? We're not moving. So we are talking and we are putting this in paper, but in reality it's a very slow pace and we need to accelerate. So what does this bill is to tell the financial sector, you have to look at your fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty cannot be just returns on investment. And when we talk about nature-based solutions, the return on investment goes from 10 to 30. And this has to also be put out there. What is the return? And it cannot be for tomorrow. The invest has to be at medium and long term. So fiduciary duty is central to any finance going into the resiliency in infrastructure. The other thing is that elephant in the room that we don't talk about, which is the conflict of interest. So we have all these boards, you know, in this financial sector, but they are just, as I've been told, in Canada, 500 people sit in all these boards. So now explain me how somebody in the board of a pension plan that's supposed to give money to a worker in 30 years, it's taking decisions to make profit now, you know? And the same thing for insurance, which is supposed to insure infrastructure for the next 30, 40 years, but they are sitting also in the fossil fuel sector. So this is very important. And the other point is about the expertise. When I talk to these boards and I ask them, okay, so you are dealing with the risk, climate risk, and you want to apply this risk, so tell me, who around you have the expertise, understand climate risk, understand that the next thing that we should be scary is mass extinction and biodiversity loss. Who in your board understands those issues? And the answer is nobody. So how can they integrate these decisions so important if there is no this knowledge? The other point is the adequacy of capital. So everybody's talking about risk. Some people are disclosing this climate-related risk, and it's only voluntary. It's not mandatory, which is changing the playing field, because those ones that declare are penalized, and those ones that don't declare are indirectly benefiting from that. So I think that it is important that the adequacy of the requirements in capital is important, because we are losing infrastructure, and somebody has to come up with adequate capitals. And so these are type of legislation, innovative legislations that are inspired by things that we've seen in many countries that needs to be applied, because the science is there, the technology is there, the methodologies and the approach are there, the risk methods are there, and we need now to implement. So when in the next COP, when in the last COP we were calling it, it was called Together for Implementation, I think we are in the 28th COP. Shouldn't we calling it reporting on implementations? I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Senator, and that was a wonderful exhortation at the end. It's no longer together in implementation, together in reporting on implementation. It's time is running out, and many quotable quotes. Financial sector needs to be climate responsive. They need to recognize their fiduciary duties. So we'll come back to some of the issues that you raised, but let me turn to Michael Schiffer. He is Assistant Administrator of USAID. So Michael, if you can talk a little bit about the United States itself. We know that the US wants to improve its infrastructure, replace infrastructure that is completing its life cycle. So how would you generate additional investment for it? What can be the role of public and private partnerships to monetize resilience? Aromar earlier talked about resilience dividends. And how do we capitalize the best capabilities of both public sector and the private enterprise?
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here at this discussion this morning. It's really a tremendous opportunity to be able to learn from you all and benefit from your perspectives. I will offer a few comments about how USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, is thinking about these questions about how we spur private sector engagement and investment and unleash private capital to help us address climate resilient infrastructure needs, primarily through our work that we do internationally, because that's where USAID is active and engaged, but also with an eye on how we may take some of this learning and apply it in our own country as well to address risk-informed infrastructure investment. And I will start by offering that our going-in assumption at USAID, as colleagues have already offered this morning, is that there is a tremendous need in the years ahead for us to be able to address in a more serious and sustained way how we fund and think in smarter ways about public-private partnerships for infrastructure investment. For the balance of the 21st century, as we think about the increased frequency and distribution and the severity and dislocation that climate change is creating, and the impact that it's having on our infrastructure, whether it's in the United States, whether it's in the global South, wherever one looks around the world these days, there is no question that this is one of the foremost challenges that we face in meeting SDG goals. Indeed, over the past couple of decades alone, more than 4 billion people, well over half of the Earth's population, has had climate-driven infrastructure distress and dislocation, and we've already racked up bills that are well north of $2 trillion. And the impact, as I know everybody in this room appreciates, is most acutely felt by the poorest of the poor, our most marginalized communities, the most vulnerable, and disproportionately by women and children. And the fact of the matter is, if we're honest about it, that governments alone are not going to be adequate to being able to meet these needs. We need to be able to figure out how to better incentivize public-private partnerships and to develop shared approaches to how we go about capitalizing these infrastructure challenges. Governments and government institutions like USAID can play important roles in catalyzing and convening, incentivizing and de-risking, and putting our own skin in the games to address the infrastructure gaps, to address market failures, and to help make markets and to help realign incentives, whether that's on the digital infrastructure side or community-based resilience. So we have been trying to think about these challenges. We've been doing it from a perspective of pragmatic experimentation, and we've been finding some success. Let me just sort of quickly rattle off a couple of areas where we've been able to find success and to drive markets and drive public-private partnerships that have helped us on these issues. First off, in Pakistan, even before the catastrophic floods in 2022, USAID, along with the government of Pakistan and private sector partners and other international partners, were able to engage to start to build climate-resilient school, primary and secondary school infrastructure. When the floods struck, that damaged over 17,000, destroyed as well, over 17,000 schools, we found that we had some infrastructure that was in place that not only was able to withstand that catastrophic flooding, but served a secondary purpose of providing shelters during the flooding. And then immediately after, again, working with the government and our private sector and other international partners, we were able to engage to unleash capital to facilitate repairs and to start to engage in new building. Not there yet, but it was one small silver lining in an otherwise extremely dispiriting set of circumstances in Pakistan. In Vietnam, starting in 2005, we worked with the Vietnamese government and provincial authorities to create the Provincial Competitiveness Index that brought together private sector and provincial governments to address government reform issues that were necessary to then unleash investment and private capital flows that have been necessary for private sector-led growth and investment. And the Provincial Competitive Index, PIC, has been a critical tool for investors as they assess risk and make assessments for where to invest, and how to direct risk and shift investments towards resilience, particularly for green growth and green investment. In Africa, we have helped to create the African Adaptation Initiative, AAI, for a food security accelerator that has scaled up private sector investment for climate resilience, food security. And again, it's a de-risking tool that's helped us to mitigate risk when it has come to channeling investments for developing new technologies and new solutions that has allowed us to look at infrastructure investments from cold storage to post-harvest processing. And again, created the right sort of structure for public-private partnerships, looking at governance issues and looking at market structure issues that is allowing us to get traction as we think about risk-informed infrastructure and investment. And lastly, in India, I'm working very, very closely with the government of India. We have worked to create a more conducive, enabling environment for the private sector to engage in energy transformation by bringing together the public sector and private sector investments to look at governance and market gaps and market disjunctions through the creation of a hydrogen and now a biofuels task force to scale up emerging fuel technology and bring down costs as we look to drive towards net zero. And lastly, working with Niti Aayog, we're looking to create on the human resilience infrastructure side a new U.S.-India higher education partnership that may allow us to find ways in which we can bridge the conceptual gap between engineers and the public sector and the private sector as the next generation of engineers and bankers and government officials go through the system to create the backbone for human infrastructure that we're going to need as we think about what the future of public-private partnerships look like for sustainable development, economic growth, and climate resilience as we face the challenges of climate change and the challenges that it creates for risk-informed infrastructure investment in the decades to come.
Thank you very much, Michael, for those examples of successes. I think to some extent you responded to Senator's call for reporting on implementation. So here are some good examples that we can draw inspiration from. Now let's turn to Abdullah Dardari. He is Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations. He heads UNDP's Arab States Bureau. So, Mr. Abdullah Dardari, the presentation that Aromar made, it started with a discussion on risk, but it really brings together SDGs, Sendai framework, and climate together. And one key message is that if we have to achieve success, any measure of success, it has to be underpinned by good risk governance and good governance. And as a UN system agency, UNDP, where promoting good governance is your core mandate, what do you have to say about this? How can we bring together more integrated approaches to address the kind of systemic risks that SRSG highlighted at the beginning of today's session? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. This is extremely timely, as UNDP has this $1 trillion moonshot to accelerate the SDGs by mobilizing and leveraging that amount of money to integrate the risk-informed infrastructure indexes and systems is extremely important. To invest $1 trillion mostly in infrastructure and then look into the question of risks and resilience will be a huge waste of time and money. Therefore, we need to make sure to integrate now, and you can say it's already a little bit too late. We still have only less than 7 years to reach 2030, and by now we have this product and the science and so on. So that is going to be building the plane while we are flying. In order to integrate this resilience and the risk calculations and systems into our SDG investments, at least the $1 trillion UNDP is trying to leverage, but we know that global investments will be much more and the needs are much more than that. So how can we influence not just the $1 trillion we are going to try, we are leveraging, but also all other SDG related investments? Let me say frankly that in most countries we work with, we haven't even yet linked infrastructure investments to the SDGs. We don't have models and systems yet that demonstrates that this investment in a national plan, in an infrastructure somewhere, is actually linked to the SDGs. That's one. Secondly, we don't know the trade-offs that those investments are going to create across the 17 SDGs because, as you all know, it's not always in the same direction. We do investments in infrastructure sometimes at the expense of the environment. So we don't have yet the systems in many developing countries that could measure those trade-offs, let alone integrate risks. Another obstacle that was raised here today, very important obstacle, is the to internalize those externalities. In the world, financial systems in most developing countries are either non-existent or very shallow. It takes a very sophisticated and deep financial system to be able to calculate and internalize the externalities so that investments go to the right place, which is risk-induced, resilient infrastructures that could serve the SDGs. We don't have that in many countries. I am responsible for the Arab region, so I'll say a few words about the region I am covering. The region has different challenges and opportunities. First, there are countries that are partially destroyed and need rebuilding. Take Syria, parts of Iraq, parts of Yemen, and now parts of Libya and Morocco. And I'm not sure whether we have a tool, which is extremely important, that can introduce risk and resilience into the immediate rebuilding of destroyed areas. Take Gaza. How many times are we going to rebuild Gaza, and do we have the tools to do that resilient rebuilding? Secondly, we have countries who have borrowed a lot of money to build infrastructure. We are not sure, and let me say, we know they have not calculated those risks and the resilience aspect when they borrowed tens of billions of dollars and became currently with a very narrow fiscal space, even to fix the resilience aspects of these investments. Thirdly, there are countries that have plenty of cash, but cash doesn't necessarily mean deep financial markets. So what I am concerned about, we know that in Saudi Arabia, the plan is to invest $2.7 trillion in the next 10 years. Is this question already integrated in the infrastructure parts of this $2.7 trillion? The good thing is that those governments, all of them, across different categories, the rich, the indebted, and the conflict settings, are asking UNDP to be their advisors in linking their investments to the SDGs, one, ensuring that that is the best combination of investments, two, so the trade-offs are the optimal trade-off we can do, and three, to introduce risk-informed infrastructure, indexes and variables and the models, which is extremely important. I'm very happy to do. I work on CGEs and link them to the SDGs, and now I have another tool that I can bring into the game and ensure that. But are we sure we can do that by 2030? We really need to start thinking beyond 2030. I think the Summit of the Future next year will be looking at that, because even the $1 trillion I said about UNDP is planning to leverage and spend on the SDGs, they may not be leveraged, nor would they be delivered and built by that time. So we need to think long term. We need to think about the different circumstances that we operate in. We need to think about the financial systems and how deep and capable they are of absorbing all these new dimensions to investments and those public-private partnerships, would they take these issues into consideration? We need to think that, are these investments, I just want to close by, I worked in one country on the budget cycle to discover at each step of the budget cycle, from the moment we design the project, to the moment we allocate the project, to the moment we implement, to the moment we monitor, corruption all over. The buildings were bound to fall because the planning was wrong, the allocation was corrupt, the implementation was corrupt, and so on. So UNDP will be helping these countries on the budgeting cycle, on the project implementation, on the corruption and the management of those infrastructures where countries borrow tens of billions of dollars to be collapsing or at least 50% efficient at best in many sectors. So it's a very complex subject matter. I'm actually impressed and pleased to see the quality of this work, which will immediately take and integrate in our practical daily work from now on. So thank you very much for a fantastic opportunity, and I see the partners lined up and ready to go together on this issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. You highlighted many challenges and particularly the whole issue of how better risk and resilience metrics can inform when we build back after major shocks is something we need to explore a bit more. The whole notion of trade-offs, how do we internalize some of these externalities, the Summit of the Future, UNDP's own $1 trillion moonshot. So I think in a sense, the clientele for this analytics is already there. We just need to close that gap. So I have about 10 questions that I've got online. I don't think we have time for all of those, but let's start with the two questions. Aromar, if you can start responding to that Mr. Suman Berry raised. His first question was a fundamental question about, are we getting a better handle on uncertainties of the future? What are the different types of uncertainties? And the second is the whole notion of what is the kind of uptake we are going to get for this kind of work in private investments, in private enterprise.
Thank you. Very engaging questions. In fact, I'll try and link my response back to what you said just now. So there are many forms of uncertainty. One of them is exactly what you're talking about just now, and that is that even CG modeling just now, the connection between the investment and the output is kind of unknown in lots of places. So that's kind of, we know analytically how to solve it, but to actually practically solve it in many contexts is, a critical question there. And I guess Suman's question then if you build on that, saying you need to connect input to outcome at least. Otherwise, goal-based, automation-based processes can land up in all kinds of issues because they are trade-offs. There's no question about that. They're trade-offs, there's non-linearity, and there are a whole range of processes. The question then is, how do you deal with both uncertainty and how you deal with externalities? So on the climate side, which I can speak for because I work on that quite a bit, and I helped write the 1.5 report, I don't think in the medium and long run there's any decline in deep uncertainty. So what we're showing you here is a different class of models. There's stochastic models that are there. They build on the past. The interesting thing is to actually connect them up with scenario-based processes, because the climate framework is built on scenarios, or even CG modeling processes, to be able to help us understand when the future is so different from the past, how we can account for it. So deep uncertainty in the climate space, and since we said 70% of the risk is sitting on the climate space, is going to increase in intensity and impact. We have an issue there. There's an analytical issue there between CG modeling at some ends, scenario-based processes, which the IPCC uses to understand what's happening in terms of pathways, and these stochastic risk frameworks. So there is a analytical piece of work to be done as far as that's concerned. And then to add on to that, if one picks up on the question of externalities, I absolutely hear you on the question of externalities, because part of the real question is, how do you integrate externalities at the current point of time, plus future externalities? Because we're talking about, as the Senator said, about infrastructures that would have service lives that go anywhere from 30 to 50 years to sometimes 100 years of lock-in. In fact, that's a big issue for investors. If you have a long-term lock-in and your discounted cash flows are in problem, then whether you're a pension fund or otherwise, this is a big issue. So the mechanism of being able to internalize those externalities are really important. And that sits, I think, at the heart of the question of how do you structure public-private partnerships, or in some senses, public-private community partnerships. Because many of the risks that we're talking about are actually, at the end of the day, they land with communities, because the communities don't have access to finance, they don't have any other processes, and the system sorts out, it doesn't work itself out. So frankly, there are analytical problems to be dealt with, plus also some fairly deep public policy questions here. I think many of the sort of conventional or orthodox forms of dealing with this stuff do not work in this environment. So I'm really glad that we're having this conversation, and CDRI and other institutions would be able to take this into concrete kind of processes, because it has to be reflected in the regulatory framework, in the legal framework that's there, and the policy instruments that have to work together. It's a non-trivial task to ask, what you're doing, even with countries with financial depth or with capacity to plan. And if you're not, then you have a serious challenge. So we have the tools, but we're not there in terms of making that connection, to be very frank.
So thank you, Aromar. We've got about 6.5 minutes. I'll take 3 questions, and they are not to address to any particular individual. Anyone can pick that up. So the one question is that CDRI's analysis talks about roads and railways, telecom, and power as the 3 sectors where most of the risk is concentrated. The question is, how do we look at social infrastructure where in absolute terms, the quantum of risk may not be high, but its downstream effect on well-being, on human development may be high? And the second part of that question is, so this is all looking at the traditional infrastructure. What about physical disaster and climate risk to renewables themselves? So do you have any reflections on that, Aromar? And then, Senator, I have a question for you. I'll come to that in a minute.
I don't want to take too much airtime, but I guess on the second question, renewables are at considerable risk, whether it's wind at one end or even solar. Large-scale solar installations are at considerable risk. They just, very simply, they need water to be able to clean the solar panels. And if you have a gigawatt-scale solar unit that's there, you have many issues. In some cases, in the climate space, some of these interventions become maladaptive. So we have to look at that transition, especially as you start, reaching out to those kind of questions. Kamal, what is the first question?
Social infrastructure.
So I think this is often a question of metrics in some senses. This is a classic problem that we face in developing countries. Because the average incomes are very small, the loss of life actually lands up to be very little, because in some senses the valuation of life is not adequate. Because we are not actually looking at the multiplier impacts of education and health adequately, and the returns on investment on education and health are typically much lower than in hard infrastructure, there's an undervaluation of its value. This is a deep debate with the Human Development Index in some senses. So there's an analytical problem there that needs to be dealt with, which I don't think we've dealt with adequately here, excepting for recognizing that it's important in physical terms, not its human implications and its implications on productivity, equity. SDGs 5 and 10 are focused on this question, and we don't have good metrics to connect the two together in some senses. Sorry, I'll stop.
Senator, you are a lawmaker. How do we make sure that the lawmaking, new legislation, new regulation is informed by risk considerations? In some manner or form, it is informed by the kind of analysis you heard being presented today.
Yes, thank you. I will just like to complete the answer of the question before, because you have to be conscious that every basic infrastructure is linear and they overlap. That's the reason, because you have the telecommunication, the water, the wastewater, everything goes one and the top of the other. One fails, it's a domino effect. Yeah. Okay, so what is happening right now, and I see it in many countries, is that some politicians refuse to be briefed on climate change, on biodiversity. And what is that? I have heard some arguments, and the most common is to say, well, if I know, I become responsible. You know, I become responsible because I cannot claim I didn't know. So we have to, yes.
Knowledge is responsibility.
Knowledge, exactly. Knowledge is responsibility and accountability. Thank you so much. But we other parliamentarians, we have to, the ones that are in oppositions, the one in different committees, expert committees, we need to ask that the proper witness come to talk to us. When I arrived to the Senate of Canada, people, climate change deniers were coming as experts to talk about climate change. You know, so there are some rules that we need to establish, and this is happening. So I trust that we will evolve and that we will ask to be informed as politicians.
Thank you very much, Senator. We have 2 minutes, and there is just one question. Anyone can take it, which is a general question. What should be the specific, concrete follow-up to this analytical work by CDRI, UNDRR, UNDP, other partners, besides the dissemination of these products? But what is it that we can do so that we can move towards informing implementation and actually having a real-world impact? Anyone? Yes, Mr. Perry.
I'm not a politician, although it's a political appointment. So I will use the lead-in. I'm glad you asked me that question to answer 2 completely different questions, if I may. And the 2 issues, firstly, I think it's been a fascinating, very rich debate, and obviously triggered by all of the thinking that went into the report. So I completely agree that, this is peeling layers of a very large onion, and the work has only just begun. My 2 questions are first, is, as it were, growth itself what an economist would call a superior good? I mean, there are figures about, about the infrastructure endowment of rich countries. And I guess the question then does become, what is the arrow of causation, okay? Because the middle income countries don't actually seem to be doing such a good job. So in the next stage of the research, is there some kind of a U-curve or something like that? At what point do you reach a tipping point, both in terms of consciousness and in terms of actually having the capabilities? Over here, I think the arrow is linear, that the resilience comes first and the growth comes later, but that needs to be tested. My second point, which is perhaps slightly more responsive, is I'm so pleased that the issue of finance has come center stage. Because just sitting in India, what we see is huge investment opportunities at the project level, in the money, large pools of capital in the Gulf, in Asia, elsewhere, but the intermediation not happening. And I think that's what partly, and so, what is that pattern of private financial intermediation that brings these 2 together, I think is a large agenda. I see CDRI operating more on what I might call the real side, but the fact that this discussion has been so much about financial intermediation and what it can do to, as it were, manage risk, I think is a great takeaway for me. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry. Abdullah, you have the last word.
You asked what follow-up action will do. We have an event on sustainable reconstruction during this week, and I think what we heard today should be presented then. So I will put together Aromar with the team, make sure that the people who are designing reconstruction should hear this stuff. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. So we have one very immediate follow-up as well. I think we've run out of time. It's been a very wonderful, rich discussion. There's a lot of work before us. I would like to thank the distinguished panelists here, Aromar, and the CDRI team for putting this together, and the staff here at the UN, the Indian mission, for supporting the organization of this event. Thank you very much, and have a fruitful SDG Action Weekend.